Hello everybody and welcome to my post-game discussion video for Assassin's Creed Syndicate. As always, I would like to share a few thoughts on the game I just finished before moving on to the next. And let me start by saying that I really enjoyed this game. I had surprisingly much fun playing it. I say surprisingly because I got the impression that this is not exactly one of the more popular entries of the franchise, but I liked it. I had fun. I think I would say I liked it more than Unity. I definitely liked it more than Rogue. And I think I liked it more than Assassin's Creed 3. I would put it somewhere at the same level as Black Flag or maybe slightly below it. And I will later speculate a bit on why I like this one in particular. But before I go into the story and so on, as always, let's talk about the gameplay a little bit. As usual, I don't have a whole lot to say about it because it's Assassin's Creed and the gameplay doesn't really change all that much. However, I think it actually changed more significantly in this game than in any other game before because of the small addition of the zipline, which changed your free running quite a bit. You weren't really parkouring as much anymore and you were mostly ziplining. So that was definitely a huge change, but one that I honestly didn't mind. I actually appreciated it because after 8 games of doing the same kind of parkouring, it was nice to do something that was a little bit different. And I mean, it was a lot of fun, right? Just, ziplining across the city and speeding things up a little bit. There were a bunch of other additions, most of which were not really my kind of gameplay, like the cart and carriage missions. We had cart and carriages before to some limited extent, but that was certainly extended in this game, and they were definitely not my favorite, but I'm sure other people enjoyed them more than I did, so to each their own. Or, stuff like the kidnappings. Again, that was interesting, but not really my kind of gameplay. But I did enjoy the zipline, and everything else in regards to the gameplay was fine the way it is. I thought the parkouring and the gameplay overall was a bit more fluid than in Unity. Unity was fine, except the fact that Arno had very sticky fingers and he kept sticking to walls and basically everything. And Jacob and Evie moved a little bit more fluidly. So I would say gameplay-wise, this was actually one of the best entries in the series so far. And I guess that's one of the reasons why I had so much fun doing it. Another thing that was a little bit different in this game was obviously the fact that we had 2 protagonists that had slightly different skill sets. They weren't vastly different, especially once you level them up completely. There were basically like 2 unique skills for each character. But you could level them up differently at the beginning and giving one character a different focus than the other, which is what I did, because the way they introduced the characters, it kind of lent itself to that kind of, different focus, focusing Jacob on combat skills and Evie on stealth skills. And, once they are leveled up, it doesn't really matter all that much anymore because they all have the same skills except for their unique skills. But still, it's an interesting, neat idea to have different protagonists that you can use for different situations. And I did use Evie specifically for those missions where I wanted to be a bit stealthier. For example, the child liberations, since they all had the requirements of not triggering any alarm, so I basically did all of them as Evie. while I used Jacob for the fight clubs, for example, because, his skills were more suited for that. So again, that was a nice and new addition. What else is there to say about the gameplay? I thought that for the most part they tried to give us a decent variety of missions and try to make missions different from each other and not always the same kind of go there and kill person B mission, but different objectives. Some had like card missions in between or all that stuff. I think for the most part it was a good variety of missions. I also thought that the optional objectives or the challenges were for the most part pretty reasonable. Reasonable in a sense that, first of all, you could, finish them without completely going out of your way. And they mostly made sense in the context of the mission. For example, you had a mission or you had an objective like, don't kill anyone, when the people involved were like not Templars or Blighters, but just royal guards or whatever. So that made sense in terms of the mission. There were a few challenges that didn't make that much sense, like when they told you to kill snipers but not use ranged weapons to do so. I mean, there's no real logical reason why Evie and Jacob would suddenly stop using ranged weapons to take out snipers. Why would they make their lives more difficult? I understand that this is the point of the challenges, to make the missions more challenging, but some of them made more sense in the context of the mission than others. But for the most part, I thought it worked out pretty well, better than in some of the previous games where I thought that the challenges just seemed utterly random and didn't really make much sense in the context of the mission. So that was pretty well done as well. Yeah, like I said, gameplay-wise, I don't really have much to criticize. Like I said, there are a few minor additions that I didn't really care for, but I could skip most of the card missions, so that wasn't a big deal. Maybe a few words on the design of the game. Again, not much to say because, as always, it looks great. I would even say that London was my favorite city so far, design-wise. It was not quite as busy and lively as Paris and Unity, but Paris was lively to an almost irritating extent and to a very distracting extent. So it sometimes was kind of hard to focus on your actual mission with all of the stuff going on. So I actually enjoyed the somewhat more quiet London, if you can even call it like that. But yeah, city looked great, and I think thanks to the addition of the zip line, they had a bit more liberty on how to design the city, because they didn't have to include all these ropes in between buildings that they had in previous cities that don't really exist in reality, but it had to be there for the sake of connecting buildings. Or you had like wide open gardens and plazas, and again, you couldn't really include a lot of them in previous games, or if you did, it would kind of interrupt your parkouring, as we've seen, for example, in Assassin's Creed 3, where the parkouring wasn't really all that well done because of the design of the city. But, I thought London worked out quite well, and it was as immersive as always, so that gets a thumbs up from me. Yeah, I guess that's mostly what I would like to say about gameplay and design and so on. Most of it is fine, I don't have much to criticize, so let's just move on to the characters and the story. Now, as for the characters, as I mentioned, we have two protagonists in this game, which on the one hand I think is a very neat idea, because I thought that both characters were interesting to a certain extent. I will talk a little bit about this later. But I also found their interactions rather endearing. And I thought it gave the game a fresh new angle. However, I also feel that this concept of having, a twin protagonist may have been a little bit of a cop-out because I can't help but feel that this was done because on the one hand they felt that, yeah, maybe it's time to finally have a female protagonist in one of our main games and not just in, one of the spin-offs, but an actual female protagonist in an Assassin's Creed main story game. But then they didn't go through with it and didn't make Evie like the sole protagonist, but instead went for the compromise of including a male character as well, which is why it feels a bit like a cop-out. As a matter of fact, if I look at the artworks for the game, it's quite obvious that Jacob is supposed to be like the main protagonist of the game. For example, the icon in the Ubisoft library is just Jacob, just Jacob's face. Or if you look at the artwork of like the physical copy, it has Jacob sitting in the center, and Evie is kind of like standing a little bit on the side, and there's a bunch of other characters standing around Jacob as well. And as far as I can tell, these are not even actual characters in the game. Not, named characters. I think they're just supposed to be like random rooks. So it's not even like Henry or Eberlin or any other associate, but just random nameless rooks and Evie. And I mean, you can kind of see that Evie is maybe a little bit more important because she's actually dressed like an assassin. But the focus is quite definitely on Jacob, and Evie is kind of just grouped in together with a bunch of no-names. So the promotion was definitely focused on Jacob. But honestly, I feel if Jacob had been the sole protagonist of this game, I don't think he would have been able to carry the game on his own. Because while I do like Jacob as a character, he very obviously exemplifies, and I'm only talking about Assassin's Creed main games now because I haven't played any of the side stories or side games, and I have no experience with those protagonists. But it seems that when it comes to the Assassin's Creed franchise, Ubisoft knows how to write exactly two different types of male protagonists. We have the broody rebel and the charming rogue. And all of the protagonists in the main games more or less fall into one of these two categories. So obviously we have Connor and Shay as the broody rebels. I would also put Arno into that category, although he did kind of start out a little bit like the charming rogue, but very quickly he fell into the broody rebel category. And in the end, it didn't really make him more interesting, just more confusing. But for the most part, I think he was more like the broody rebel type. And then obviously we have the charming rogues, which would be Ezio and Edward, and now Jacob. Now, to be fair, these characters are not all exactly the same. Ezio, for example, had the benefit of having 3 games to develop as a character. So the first game, Ezio had a different personality than, Revelations Ezio, for example. And I guess Ezio was a bit more like the upper class rogue, whereas Edward and Jacob are more like the classic blue collar rogues. So there are differences, but I think you can see that there are these two, stereotypes, and most of the protagonists so far are one of those. So if Jacob had been the only protagonist in this game, I'm not sure if he really would have been interesting enough to carry the game on his own, because he probably would have ended up a lot like Edward in particular. So pairing him with Evie gave him an interesting and new aspect. So I think it was a good decision to have two protagonists. Or, they could have just made Evie the sole protagonist, because I think she would have been able to bring a few new aspects to the table. But quite obviously, that's not the way they went. But like I said, I found the interactions between the siblings kind of endearing, so I'm not too mad about the fact that they went this route. I wouldn't say that Jacob or Evie are specifically deep characters. I mean, a lot of their character was basically reduced to this sibling relationship, and we never really learned a lot about their backstory except in codex entries and so on. And I always feel it's nice to have a game actually show you stuff like this and not just dump it into a codex entry. So they certainly could have done more with their character development, but I still found them endearing and entertaining enough, and I liked playing as both of them. I mean, I did mostly play Evie when I had the choice, but sometimes I would pick Jacob too, just for the fun of it. Also, I guess having two different characters actually gives a little bit of additional replay value to the game, because you can try to do certain missions as Evie and then maybe on your next attempt as Jacob. I mean, it's not a huge difference, but I guess they may have a little bit of different dialogue and you can try different strategies and so on. So I guess there's that as well. But yeah, that's what I would like to say about the protagonists. Maybe let's talk about the story. Well, what can I say about the story? It exists. It is a very standard Assassin's Creed story. There's an evil Templar. There's some kind of precursor artifact that you have to find. And that's about it. There isn't really much more to the story. As in many other previous Assassin's Creed games, the story is very compartmentalized, so you have a lot of small stories that are just, added together. And some of them were actually pretty interesting, like the one with Maxwell Roth, for example. And there were other interesting small stories. But of course, the problem is when your stories are basically just one or two sequences long, is that they never really get the chance to fully develop as a story. So I would say that the overall plot was maybe the weakest part of the game, because there was barely a plot to speak of, I would say. But again, that is fairly common, because many Assassin's Creed games have the same problem, more or less. Maybe let's also talk a little bit about our villain, Starrick. Well, I have one positive thing to say about him. He was certainly memorable. And you may remember that in some of the previous games, specifically Assassin's Creed Black Flag, my criticism was that I could barely remember who I was fighting. I mean, in Black Flag, we at least had Roberts, the sage, who was fairly memorable. But most of the Templar enemies, I always forgot their names. And when the final mission arrived and I had to kill like the final big Templar Grandmaster, I had totally forgotten this guy even existed. I'm actually trying to remember his name right now and I can't. I think he was called Taurus. But he was completely forgettable. And honestly, I'm currently having problems remembering the main villain from Unity as well. I think it was the other sage, Germain. I guess he was kind of the main villain. I guess he was slightly more memorable, but still not very interesting. So you can say what you want about Starrick. He was certainly memorable in his over-dramatic form. I didn't really think he was much of a threat because he never really did anything. He was just sitting around drinking tea and killing his own people. But at least I remembered him, so that's good. And I actually have to admit, I kind of enjoy these overdramatic comic book villains. I mean, it's nice to have a villain that is a little bit more nuanced and a little bit more balanced, I guess. But if you can't really include that because you don't have the time to have such a nuanced villain, then I think it's completely fine to go with a comic book villain and just make him over the top. As a matter of fact, I think our over the top villain kind of fit pretty well with the game in general, because the whole game felt a little bit more over the top and almost a little bit goofy at times, more so than some of the previous games. And honestly, I think that is one of the reasons why I like this game more than Unity, for example, or Assassin's Creed 3. Because, honestly, the whole premise of the franchise is a little bit goofy, so maybe I just enjoyed when the game doesn't take itself too seriously and is trying to have a bit of fun with its premise and is not afraid to, be a little bit goofy about it. So I think the reason why I didn't enjoy Unity and Rogue and Assassin's Creed 3 quite as much is because they were just too serious about everything. And, games like Black Flag or this one were trying to have a bit more fun with their premise, and I think I do really appreciate that. I mean, for example, we had these rather over-the-top card interactions, which almost felt like some kind of Victorian GTA. I think that was what they were going for. That wasn't realistic at all. Neither was a zipline or stuff like that, but it was fun. So I think it's great if the game goes a little bit over the top. As long as they don't go too much into ridiculousness, I think it actually helps the game because, like I said, if you really look at it, the whole premise of the franchise is a little bit ridiculous. And if you don't take the whole thing too serious, I think it actually benefits the game and doesn't harm it. So yeah, I had fun with this game, and I even enjoyed the ridiculous villain, even though, like I said, he never really seemed much of a threat, to be honest. Now maybe let's talk a little bit about the present day story as well. And I have to say, I actually was a little bit surprised that the present day story with Juno and so on did get some progress in this game. I wasn't honestly expecting that anymore, since that story has been stagnating ever since the end of Assassin's Creed 3, basically. And nothing really happened in that story at all. I wasn't too unhappy about it, because by the time that Unity came along, I was like, well, I kind of stopped caring about that story at this point, and I was kind of glad that they got rid of the present day gameplay sequences, which never really were all that interesting, because simply being out of the Animus kind of limits the gameplay, since a lot of the gameplay functions are tied to the Animus. So the out of Animus gameplay always felt underwhelming and very bare bones. So I was glad that they got rid of it. And I actually think the way that they did it in this game, by just having like cutscenes that shows what happens in the real world, is actually a pretty good solution to this problem. So we still have some progress in the story, but we don't have the rather bland out of Animus gameplay that we had in some of the previous games. So I was a little bit excited by the fact that we actually got some progress in the story. But then I remembered what people told me in the comments, which is basically that this story will get dropped eventually, and it's not actually going to get finished in the games anyway, but instead they just finish that story in a comic book. So I guess I'm not going to see an actual solution to that little cliffhanger we had at the end, at least not in a game. I actually have to read a comic book for that. So that's kind of disappointing, because I felt that they finally found a good format to tell this present day story without being too disruptive. So I wouldn't mind if they had continued this kind of format, but apparently they didn't. That being said, however, even though I did enjoy this game and, I had a lot of fun playing it, I can totally see that the standard Assassin's Creed formula that has been more or less unchanged since the first game is starting to wear very, very thin. And that there isn't really that much they can do with that formula anymore. The most prominent proof for that is the fact that the main stories are hardly any more than a repeat of the same story over and over again. Kill the big Templar guy and find some precursor artifact, and that's about it. So I can totally understand that at this point they decided, okay, we need to re-innovate the whole concept. We need to change more than just adding a few new gameplay features, and we need to take the series in a different direction. And I am very much looking forward to that. I know a lot of people say, well, the newest game aren't really Assassin's Creed anymore. At this point, I'm ready for something new. Maybe my experience is a little bit different because I've played all the games in a relatively short amount of time, whereas those people who played them when they came out played them over a much longer amount of time. But I'm ready for something new. So I am really looking forward to the new Assassin's Creed games, the different Assassin's Creed games. Obviously, I'm in particular looking forward to the next one, Origins, because it's ancient Egypt, and I have a very special relationship with ancient Egypt because it basically started my love and interest for history. So I can't wait to dive into that game. But as I already mentioned at the end of the previous episode, there will be one game in between as always, but it's a very short one. It's To the Moon. It's just a few hours long. So I would estimate that Origins is going to start in maybe 2 weeks, the latest. We will see. But yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have to say about it. So to summarize, I like the characters, although I like them mostly for their interactions with each other than for their characters themselves, because they were not the most well-developed characters, I would say. But they were still, charming enough to keep me hooked. I really enjoyed the gameplay. The story was pretty generic, at least the overall plot. But the smaller stories kept me interested well enough. So yeah, that would be basically my overall judgment of the game. Let me know what you thought about this game and what you liked and what you didn't like. And yeah, that's basically it. There will be one day off, as always, and then we're going to start To the Moon. And I hope you're looking forward to that. And if not, I hope you're coming back once I'm starting Assassin's Creed Origins and take my Assassin's Creed journey to a new and different level and experience, I hope. So yeah, as always, thank you for watching, thank you for listening to my rambling, and see you again next time.